Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name's Adam Bychawski. I'm an assistant editor here at Open Democracy. Open Democracy is an independent global media organization. Our mission is to challenge power and inspire democratic debate across the world. I'm so pleased to have this fantastic panel here today to discuss the future of migration after COVID-19. I'm just going to hand over now to our host, Anna, and she'll introduce our guests. I'll be back later to tell you a little bit about the next event in our webinar series and how you can keep in contact with us. But for now, please do enjoy, and here's Anna.
Thank you very much, Adam. Very pleased to meet you all, even if it is always on Zoom rather than in person. And I'm very happy to be here. This webinar is part of our Canada Excellence Research Chair Program webinar series, but also our first webinar in collaboration with Open Democracy. Open Democracy and the CERC in Migration at Ryerson University has a joint blogging space called Pandemic Borders that I hope all of you or many of you have visited online. And as you can imagine, the Pandemic Borders blogging space started in late April as we had all been surprised by the pandemic and were working from home. The blogging space has now entered a new phase where we discuss the migration futures. So what happens now, during, but also as the pandemic hopefully leaves us, we leave it behind. So what happens in relation to migration and in looking at different world regions as well as Canada where we are based. And actually it was nice that Adam said good evening, and well, for us it's good afternoon. And for many people maybe who are connected, it's even good morning. So without further ado, actually our webinar has one more participant that might be having technical problems to enter. So I'll present him now and he'll probably answer to my questions last. So in this webinar, we have Randall Hansen, who is from the Munk School at the University of Toronto, Maria Hwang from McGill in Montreal, Oreva Olakpe, who is a research fellow at the Canada Excellence Research Chair Program at Ryerson, but currently based in Lagos in Nigeria, and Rhacel Parreñas that joins us from the University of Southern California. So really we're covering a good part of the globe this evening, thinking that Adam is sitting and his team is sitting in the UK. So in this Zoom world, it is important to think about what happens in migration. So I'd like to start with Maria, because this webinar of today has a particular focus also on women, what happens with migrant women. So how do you think, Maria, has the pandemic set tighter limit, particularly to women's movement?
Thank you, Anna, for the introduction, for the question, and for having me here. I'm very grateful. Indeed, restrictions on women's mobility have been a defining feature of migration policies and border control. And in an Open Democracy piece that I co-author with Dr. Parrenas, we discuss how migrant women are facing increased mobility limitations during COVID-19 as a result of border closures, state control on migrant women, and also as a result of employers' power over migrant workers. What I'd like to add to that is that what this pandemic has also revealed is that migrant women are increasingly facing restrictions imposed not only by destination countries, but by origin countries as well. So let me discuss the case of the Philippines, which many of us know is a major labor sending country. So in response to the pandemic, the Philippine government has put in place two key border and labor migration restrictions. In February, and following the first confirmed COVID-related death in the country, the Philippine government declared a temporary travel ban for those heading to and returning from China, Hong Kong, and Macau. So the New York Times described this travel ban unusual in that it prevents Filipino citizens from leaving the country. So this travel ban impacted those who hold permanent residency in Hong Kong and overseas Filipino workers, including migrant domestic workers and skilled workers. This travel ban also prevented Filipinos from leaving the country as tourists, which essentially trapped and left without any source of income migrant Filipino women who engage in sex work in Asian global cities and cross borders as visa-free tourists. The second COVID-related immigration restriction imposed by the Philippine government is its migration ban on healthcare workers, which was put in place in April. The government justified this its decision as a matter of national interest to ensure that the country continues to have adequate supply of healthcare workers. So this ban has been relaxed to allow the migration of those who have obtained employment contracts within a specific cutoff date. But many healthcare workers, and in particular nurses, are still unable to migrate. And then we can deduce that this migration ban has significant impact on women because nursing remains a female-dominated profession. So these migration restrictions counter our assumptions about labor-sending countries like the Philippines, as primarily concerned about facilitating the export of its migrant workers. But to the contrary, the Philippine government has long established protectionist immigration restrictions for certain migrant workers, and in particular women. And this is actually one of the topics of my research. A sociologist, Nana Owushi, has observed many labor-sending countries in Asia have imposed immigration restrictions on women workers in particular. What I also found in my research is that the Philippine government has developed an infrastructure for monitoring the outmigration of Filipinos. So since 2010, and as part of the Philippines anti-trafficking campaign, the Philippine Bureau of Immigration has been strictly monitoring all international bound Filipino travelers. Subject to even more stringent immigration scrutiny are Filipinos who attempt to leave the country as tourists, as it is assumed that tourist travel is a common migration channel for human trafficking, illegal recruitment, and undocumented labor migration. So under this trafficking policy, the Bureau of Immigration is given the power to suspend Filipinos' constitutional right to travel, which is affirmed by the Supreme Court in its ruling that the Filipinos' right to travel is not absolute and may be impaired in the, quote, interest of national security, public safety, and public health, close quote. And so because of this anti-trafficking immigration policy, thousands of Filipinos are barred from travel each year, and a disproportionate number of them are women. So now that the Philippine government has already relaxed travel, the screening of Filipinos who are traveling internationally continues still. So I just want to conclude by saying that it is clear that the pandemic has heightened mobility restrictions on women. And I want to emphasize that this is not only coming from destination countries, but a lot of these restrictions are also imposed by sending countries like the Philippines. And so moving forward, I think we must be vigilant to make sure that these state-controlled do not become permanent features of migrant women's migration experiences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. I think what you say is very interesting in actually questioning the role of countries of origin and showing how these gendered patterns of protection in inverted commas, but also if you want restrictions and tighter regulation impact women. And also the fact that, as we know, there are very severe repercussions caused by the interruption of mobility and migration due to the pandemic, which really have a very high impact on migrants and their families back home. And with this, I'd like to turn to Oreva Olakpe and ask Oreva about how has the pandemic really affected migration flows and migrant experiences. If you can give us a view from countries, outside North America and Europe, specifically from Western Africa. Turn on your microphone.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'd like to thank the CERC and Open Democracy for the opportunity to be on this panel. I really appreciate it. I'll just go straight to the point. In terms of what has been going on in the Global South, which is a huge block, but I'll speak mostly from the perspective of African migrants. Generally in the global south, particularly African countries, were very quick to impose very swift, stringent lockdown policies. So even before we had a confirmed case of the coronavirus, there was already a lockdown. And then 10 days later, after the lockdown was announced, that was when we had our first confirmed case. So because of that, because of how swift and how stringent the lockdown was, it kind of slowed down the spread of the pandemic in African countries, at least, especially, I'm speaking from West Africa. And as a result, I think that that's something going forward. I feel like African countries will be swift, especially coming from the experience we had with the Ebola epidemic and the lessons learned from slow responses, because slow responses on the part of countries like Nigeria led to the spread of Ebola in 2014. So this time, the swift response kind of stymied the progress of the pandemic. And then another impact was the drop in regional migration. In regions like West Africa, freedom of movement and migration are regional norms. So the borders are not are not barriers to movement the same way it is in the West, for example. But because of the pandemic, I think the IOM reported that regional migration in West Africa specifically dropped by almost 50%. So because of the stringent lockdown policies, a lot of agricultural workers and nomadic pastoralists could no longer move. So because of the restriction on their movement, their way of life was hampered. And we're at the moment, we're seeing, we're no longer under lockdown, but we're seeing, we're having a lot of agricultural problems. The cost of food has gone up. And because the cost of food has gone up, there are a lot of tensions. In Nigeria, for example, the food inflation is something that is a very big problem here right now. And then talking about other parts of other aspects of South-South migration, poorer countries are often seen as places where diseases are embedded. And this has shaped how migrants from the global South are treated when they apply for visas, when they encounter borders, and it affects how they are treated in the countries they migrate to and reside in. We all know that entire migration processes are built around testing migrants in the global South to ensure that they have no diseases in order for them to be able to get visas. And this is something that is linked to the racialization of diseases in the global health system. And a good example of how this kind of response played out during the pandemic was in China, where African migrants in cities like Guangzhou that have a high population of Africans face a lot of discrimination and heavy-handed migration policies. In Guangzhou specifically, Africans faced forced evictions. They were denied access to accommodation. They faced police brutality, targeted and forced quarantine, and the seizures of their passports. So because of that, it's a situation that heightens the visibility of undocumented migrants, because when you are no longer able to access accommodation, you are no longer able to find spaces to stay, places to work because of the color of your skin, and you are suspected to be carrying or spreading a virus because of where you are from or what you look like. In that kind of scenario, it's very difficult for African migrants, especially those who are undocumented, to be able to continue their continue living in dignity. So, for example, focusing on China, the activities of migrants have this year, because of the pandemic, started to draw attention, a lot of attention from authorities. And there will be no or little room for irregular forms of migration because of the attention, the focus on African migrants in China. Another aspect of the pandemic is relating specifically to undocumented migrants, because that's my area of focus, is the fact that because they are undocumented, they are untraceable. And that untraceability is a characteristic that does not bode well in a pandemic kind of arrangement, a pandemic scenario where people like the health assessment procedures have to test and trace people. The fact that you have to test and trace means that you have to know the people that are there. And also the fact that the coronavirus is, there's a lot of asymptomatic spread. So because you don't know, because undocumented migrants are untraceable, there's this fear that, oh, they're going to spread the virus. And based on actual surveys or research that was done, it was proven that actually African migrants were not spreading the coronavirus, contrary to the popular fear that people were having. In fact, in China specifically, 90% of the people who were confirmed positive were people with Chinese passports, and foreigners were a very small percentage of that, and Africans were an even smaller percentage of that. And then another thing about China, the China case, is that what it's highlighting for the future is that there will be more focus on technology and surveillance for mobility control. This is because when the virus was spreading, the Chinese government decided to collaborate with Alibaba and Tencent to create this app called Health Code, which is a system that assigns color codes to users to indicate their health status and determine whether they can access public spaces like malls and airports and other public places. And because of this, the way the health code works is that to obtain a code, people have to fill in personal information, including like passport numbers, phone numbers, and things like that. And in terms of an undocumented migrant, there's no way for an undocumented migrant to have a health code because they don't have any form of ID that they can use to sign up for that. The way the code works is that when you sign up for it, you are asked to report your travel history and whether you've come in contact with a COVID patient. And depending on what you fill out, it will give you, you'll be assigned a QR code in red, amber, or green. Red means you have to go to get isolated and treated because you probably have been exposed. Amber means you just have to self-quarantine. And then green means you're free to go into any public space. What this kind of thing means, it gives the government access to monitor the movement of everybody in the country and makes it harder for undocumented migrants to move around and carry on their business. Another issue, speaking about other parts of the global South, was public transport service and movement disruptions in places like India, in China, and in Latin America, where there's a lot of internal migration going on. The pandemic led to disruptions in transport services and movement, which made a lot of migrant workers to be stuck. And a lot of people had to, they couldn't find their way home, or they couldn't find their way to places of work. And that just generally impacted the quality of life of migrants. I've already talked about transhumans, where agricultural workers, transborder traders, and herders in places like West Africa could not move, they could not earn a living as well. And then another point is the increase in human trafficking and smuggling because of how stringent the lockdown policies were, and the fact that till now a lot of borders are still closed or semi-closed. A lot of people have been forced to rely on irregular forms of on irregular migration. So, for example, there were articles talking about how women in Latin America a lot of women are falling into trafficking because they became homeless because of the pandemic, or they lost their jobs, or they were experiencing extreme forms of poverty. So things like that are shaping how the situations that migrants are finding themselves in and how they will move forward after the pandemic is over. And then another point is about internally displaced people and border communities who have been facing heightened obstacles to migration pathways because of restricted access to humanitarian aid. So these things have, for IDPs, it means that if they are having obstacles to migration pathways or restricted access to humanitarian aid, it means that irregular pathways would be looking more appealing. So these are things that I feel are important to note as the impact of the pandemic and going forward. The last thing I wanted to say is just about how.
Thank you, but I think I have to give a chance to Rhacel and Randall also to say, I think you mentioned a lot of very important things in terms of how the pandemic has both interrupted regional migration, which is actually in Africa, it's more than 80% of the total out migration, and often people in Europe or North America ignore this. And also very interesting insights about what happens in China. And again, here, for instance, in Canada, where we have a lot of fellow citizens who are Chinese Canadian or recent Chinese immigrants, there's been a lot of concern about xenophobia and racism expressed as we know, south of this border, there was a lot of racist talk in the US in terms of the virus. So it is very interesting also to see how this plays out in China, and these are insights we don't usually have. I think the vulnerabilities that you discussed bring us very naturally to Rachel's, how can I say, domain and expertise, because I wanted to ask you, Rhacel, whether do you think and how the pandemic may have, made more acute the dependence of the global economy on exploitable migrant labor. So how does this play out now with the pandemic? Turn on your microphone.
So yeah, I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning from Los Angeles. I've been reading actually the chats. There's already a question for me to talk about the impacts of COVID-19 on transnational parenting. Unfortunately, because I only have 5 minutes, I can't address that question. I just want to let the person in the audience know that I read it because I was asked, like Anna just mentioned, to talk about how COVID-19 specifically has deepened the world's dependence on exploitable labor. This question is actually pretty timely because of, I don't know if people saw this in the news yesterday. There's a lawsuit of family against Tyson Foods, which is a meat processing industry here in the United States, not because of the death of a worker from that facility, but because the management of that factory facility, they had wagered a bet on how many workers will get COVID while they are requiring them to work. So I actually want to focus on that, sort of tragic reality that's going on, particularly in the United States, which has become the epicenter of this pandemic. So it's important, but it's important for us to begin by first establishing that when we think about the situation of migrant workers and their exploitability, that COVID-19 is not necessarily a creator of new inequalities, but instead it just merely magnifies existing inequalities. And we see that very clearly in the situation of migrant workers. So I want to get into this question of their situation and their exploitability by situating our understanding of it in the emergence of what's called essential workers during this pandemic. And after all, it's because in the global north, especially, it's people of color and immigrants who have historically been doing most of this work. And so these are ultimately jobs that meet our basic needs for human survival. And so essential work includes, the provision of transportation, healthcare, food and agriculture, security, janitorial services, and of course, domestic work. And in the United States, essential workers include, Southeast Asian meat processing workers in South Dakota, for example, Latinx farm workers in Florida, Philippine nurses, and migrant domestic workers of various nationalities across the country. And perhaps with the exception of nurses, most of this work is considered low wage, low status, low skill. They're undesirable jobs. And because of this, they tend to be poorly remunerated. A report that the US Department of Labor released for using statistics from the US Department of Labor, you can see that people in essential work earn significantly less than other workers. So for example, they earn almost 50% less in Washington, DC, and about 25% less in New York. And so I want to ask, are essential workers exploited, or does their symbolic celebration during this current pandemic counter or mitigate their potential exploitation? And so there are many essential workers. So in the US alone, there's about 48 million of them. But we should note that not all of them are regarded equally. And so essential workers comprise of this deeply segmented pool. And so some are celebrated. For instance, healthcare workers, the community applauds them at 8 p.m. every evening, or that they receive free housing from the state. But but most essential workers do not receive any special treatment. They're actually not lauded, but instead they're discounted. And as you see, they're really devalued, as we see with a lawsuit going on with Tyson Foods right now. And so the vast majority of essential workers are like those, meat processing workers in Tyson Foods, in that they're invisible workers whose labeling as essential basically functions as a controlling mechanism that employers can then use to maximize their labor. So this is the case, for example, not only in that Tyson Food factory, but also in Smithfields in South Dakota. And so while their work is deemed necessary, so that it is essential, the workers are not essential. So it's the work and not the workers who are essential. And so the outbreak of COVID-19 in this one meat processing facility, for example, in not just in Iowa, but also in South Dakota for Smithfield's Food, it was not blamed on the lack of protective gear for workers or the fact that they have to work in such close proximity to each other, but instead it was blamed on the lifestyle of the migrant workers, who were dismissed and blamed as being quote unquote different from having a traditional American family. But let me say a few words about domestic work, which is what I know best about, and how they're faring during this pandemic. And so in this case, we see with domestic workers, the use of essential work, as well as the pandemic, as mechanisms that employers use to maximize their labor. So testimonies that were shared in town hall meetings hosted by migrant advocacy groups, Filipino Worker Center in Los Angeles and Damayan in New York, indicate that employers who retain their domestic workers during this pandemic are actually demanding that they shift from live out to live in work. And the essentialness of their job is basically used by employers as this controlling mechanism to morally justify this demand. But employers are not necessarily paying them sufficiently for the added work of switching from live out to live in. And so it is said that it's about 6 hours per day that they're working more, but they're not necessarily seeing an increase in their pay. The pandemic also, unfortunately, is one that employers use to justify the sudden termination of domestic workers. And so they're very, expendable. And so we see that, for example, in the case of Lebanon, where you hear that employers are leaving Ethiopian domestic workers at the doorsteps of the embassy without sufficient airfare to return back to Ethiopia. In New York, Damayan did an informal survey of 100 workers, and they found that 80% of them had their hours reduced, or they have since lost their job during the pandemic. And in the case of the 80% that Damayan had surveyed, they found that employers were using the pandemic to justify the minimum remuneration that they were extending to domestic workers. And so we see then that the pandemic is being used by employers as a means of morally justifying termination without adequate compensation, but also morally justifying their increased demands of domestic workers, likewise for inadequate pay. So let me end there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rhacel. Yeah, I think you raised a very important point about the essential work versus essential workers. And I think the question that arises from all that you described, that is very correct, is what will happen after the emergency is over? Because we still live in a state of emergency, and I think it might last until next spring. I think the question that I want to ask Randall is, how do we see the future of global migration shaping up as we leave the pandemic behind? Of course, it's a $1 million question, but I think you can tackle it, Randall.
Yeah, I've been working with my crystal ball for the last 3 days. So thanks very much, Anna, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join such a distinguished panel. And so my question was, what is the future for global migration? And that depends really on the lessons we draw from the last 8 months. And what we've seen is that migrant workers, above all low-skilled migrant workers, have really suffered some combination of 4 fates: unemployment, internment, expulsion, and infection. And as we observe their misery, thousands shoved across the Yemeni-Saudi border, tens of thousands combined in barracks in Singapore, tens of thousands infected in Europe and in North America, and hundreds of thousands joining long lines trudging through India. What we have learned, actually we should have known this, what we've seen again, is that the world is entirely dependent on cheap migrant labor. And this picks up on some points that Rhacel and Oreva made. Across the world, in the global south, as much as the global north, there's no dependency theory here, a large number of sectors would not exist without cheap migrant labor. Meat packing, meat processing, agriculture, fishing, construction, textiles, and domestic work. And in some countries, India, China, Thailand, Malaysia, Taiwan, the very wealth of the country via exports depends on cheap migrant labor. The conditions in which these migrant laborers work is appalling when they are documented, and when they are undocumented, which probably half of them are, the conditions approach that of human slavery. So in short, what we eat, where we live, and what we wear depends squarely on a reservoir of exploitable and disposable migrant labor. We depend on the labor, the misery, and at the moment, the deaths of others. This is what we know. What of the future? Well, we won't know it until we know it. It's a known unknown, to quote Rumsfeld, who did so much to generate hundreds of thousands of forced migrants. We won't know until we know, But to my mind, two widely circulating predictions are dead wrong. The first is that we will somehow learn the lessons of the last 8 months and emerge in a more just and equitable world. I'm quite sure the intention will be there, at least I hope it will be, but the money will not. And when we are poor in conditions of scarcity, it is always the poor who suffer more. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, we will not have less global unskilled migration because our dependence upon it is not contingent, but structural. And there's two aspects to this. As I said already, multiple sectors would not exist without cheap migrant labor. But second, our middle class and upper middle class lifestyles, affordable clothes, food, smartphones, holidays, nannies, cleaners, all of that depends on a ready supply of disposable migrant labor. Let me give you two quick examples. In 2017 in Los Angeles, a garment worker making dresses for TJ Maxx made $3.42 per hour. The dress she made cost just under $25. Had she been paid the federal minimum wage of $7.25, that dress would have cost $30.50. Had she been paid the Los Angeles minimum wage of $12 an hour, which is still lousy pay, but had she been paid that, that dress would have cost $39 or 55% more. Let's go to the high end. The average smartphone is about $1,000, leaving aside discounts. A Foxconn worker in China making that iPhone earns $3.15. If we made that iPhone in Seattle and paid Seattle's minimum wage, an iPhone would cost $285 more, or 1/3 more expensive. So in the end, the mass global migration of the unskilled, the exploited, the disposable unskilled, that exists because we want to pay less and less, and ideally nothing, for more and more. Now, the fallacy of the second false prediction, that we'll have less global migration, relates back to the first. In a poorer world, and this I'm sure, we will be poorer after COVID-19. In a poorer world, the demand for cheap goods and services will not fall. On the contrary, it's going to increase. If we fail to recognize that fact, if we maintain or throw up new borders to immigration, we will not get less immigration. We will simply get less documented and more undocumented immigration. And if the undocumented sector expands, so too will its attendant miseries: contract substitution, confinement, wage theft, dangerous conditions, endless hours, and sexual and physical abuse. So the future, in short, is going to be grim. How grim it is depends on what we do. And I'll leave that for discussion.
Well, thank you, Randall. Okay, that was a bit of a pessimistic note. I want to play devil's advocate and also remind us that, however, at least in Europe and North America, the immediate reaction of governments, and okay, I say North America, but I'm not sure if I should say North America or only Canada, as I'm not sure in how it is in the US, but and in the different states in the US. But I should say that there are very recent reports of the European Migration Network and the OECD that show that generally countries extended the legal status of people with precarious status or with no status, extended emergency health to all of them. There's been regularization programs, the largest probably in Italy, with over 200,000 applicants registered when it finished in August, and it's now being processed. In Canada, there was a small, I would say very small regularization program for asylum seekers who are working in the senior care industry. There have been significant calls for improvement of these working conditions. I think we are all agreeing that the question is what will happen once there is no such urgency for this essential work, when we go back to normal. And I think what you say, Randall, is right. There will be, a difficult time for all countries, for some worse than others in terms of the pandemic effects. But I think that the one question is what will be the political will on the part of governments? And on the other hand, I think the specific challenges for countries that are mainly countries of origin, and I'm thinking of the countries that Maria mentioned, like one example is the Philippines, but not only the Philippines. We know that they're very important right now, return and reintegration challenges. I think also, I mean, all the panelists, Oreva and Randall and Rhacel, mentioned, for instance, the fact that migrants have been forcibly returned, like Ethiopians, for instance, from Lebanon or from, Saudi Arabia. And these are countries that cannot cater with the reintegration costs, plus they have lost their remittances. So I think the question that I would like to ask all four of you is, what could be a way forward? So could there be, and what is the role of the global governance right now? I mean, before the pandemic, we had just been, how can I say, at least partly satisfied that there was a global compact, and at least countries were showing some political will to engage with one another, regardless of whether they were origin, destination, or both origin and destination countries or transit countries in working on governing global migration. Of course, there was too much, in my view, emphasis on safe and orderly and regular migration. As you said, Randall, a lot of migration does not happen through the safe and orderly pathways. So what can we expect from these mechanisms? And I don't know who wants to start in trying to answer my question. So what can we expect from the mechanisms of global governance of migration in foreseeing these challenges of increased exploitation, increased poverty, and increased imbalances, and at the same time trying to build on the many positive emergency measures that we have seen? I don't know, maybe I can ask Rhacel.
Yes, and so thank you for this question about, what are our next steps. And so looking at, the case of domestic workers, I think what this pandemic is, calling attention to for advocates, but also, it's still ignored in mainstream discussions, is, the plight of informal workers, undocumented workers, workers that, that I said are, pretty much like invisible here, whether they're formal workers, whether they're like employed, but they're not in the front stage, right, of this pandemic, but they're doing a lot of the backstage work that's keeping us afloat, like keeping food, giving us continued access to food, like farmers, meat processing workers. So what we do know is that a lot of, civic organizations have been giving attention to them. So while, the state of California, for example, has extended some services to undocumented workers because they know that they don't qualify for, the unemployment that all the other workers are collecting. And so I think that to develop strategies or develop policies and solutions that look at the plight of informal and undocumented workers, I think is like one necessary step.
Thank you, Rhacel. Yeah, good. Thank you. Good point. I know Randall wanted to say something about it, and I see this. Yeah, Randall, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much for all those comments. I mean, let's distinguish two issues here. The question is, will we remain dependent on cheap migrant labor? And there I stand my ground. That is not going to change for a moment, because it flows from the way in which global capitalism has evolved since the 1970s, where we've seen the stagnation of middle-class wages, the collapse in low-skilled wages, the utter decimation of the union movement in the United States, above all. And what we've also seen is that the middle class has maintained its standard of living in the context of stagnant wages on the back of cheap labor. And the digital revolution has only accelerated this process because more and more of us expect to pay little or nothing for our services. We resent it when we have to pay delivery for Amazon, and the transportation is shot through all over the world, including in Germany, which is human rights, rule of law, strong unions of human trafficking. So that flows directly from the nature of capitalism, the nature of middle class expectations. If those cheap migrant laborers will be better treated than they are now, that was the contingent part of what I said at the end of the open question. It depends on how we react. And we might have a moment where we recognize this dependence, we regularize the undocumented, we open new channels for low-skilled immigration, and stop this myth that we aren't all dependent on low-skilled immigration and that countries only need high-skilled immigration. But I'm not sure that that's going to happen. You know, once COVID ends and we face the structural economic damage, your own country, Greece, migrants suffered terribly after the Euro crisis. It's a function of resources, and nativism always flourishes in times of scarcity, and it's easier to round on immigrants. Two last comments, I don't want to dominate. Canada, we can forget about for purposes of global migration. You can't, you know, let's try and get it right here, but you can't generalize from it. It's a country that has perfectly controlled borders, ice, water, and there's a wall between us and Mexico that we got the Americans to pay for. The country also is one of the few that only lets in high-skilled immigrants. Global governance, I want to stop talking, we come back to that. It's a noble purpose, but for the moment, we mostly come up with a series of well-meaning platitudes rather than much change on the ground. That's a bit provocative, but I want to let others come in. Thanks.
Thank you, Randall. I like the last thing about the wall between Mexico and Canada. Now, okay, I think I'll play devil's advocate again, because I think if you think of Italy is a country that, and I lived in Italy before coming here for a long time. So Italy is a country that is geographically close to areas of both political unrest and economic hardship. So unlike Canada, that people vote with their feet and cross the border is common. Of course, I think what we're learning is that there is no general political and social acceptance that actually Italy needs a lot of these less skilled or skilled, not highly skilled migrants. And it only happens when there is an emergency and there is a regularization procedure. And I think what you all said in your presentations was exactly there are specific sectors where the political economy of globalization predicates that these sectors are based on cheap migrant labor. But I think thinking forward, one thing that we can think of is also the impact of kind of fair trade campaigns or fair work campaigns. And again, and I don't mean to say that by this that Italy is any good or best example, but for instance, in the agri-food sector, there has been several local initiatives in the last years defending the rights of really severely exploited farm workers through mobilizing local supermarkets, mobilizing local people, supermarkets using the expression, we sell produce that is, free of exploitation. And I think there is something to be said there. We have also a question from the panel, and maybe Oreva or Maria want to take it, which is about what is our responsibility as intellectuals, as academics? And because you're the youngest, I think you have the responsibility and the privilege to answer that, Maria.
I'll take on that question since I'm just started, my position as assistant professor. For me, really, my advocacy work happens in the classroom. I think there are a lot of, here at McGill, there are actually a lot of students who are interested in this topic. I teach migration classes, focusing especially on women's labor migration. And there is, I think, a will amongst the young students, the young people, to really address these problems. But what I also would like to point out is there's actually a lot of I mean, I'm an ethnographer. I can't do, face-to-face research right now, but I go online and I'm heartened to see that there is some mobilization going on. For instance, Filipinos who come to the United States under J-1 visas have been mobilizing, especially those who have lost their jobs in service industry and also hotel industry. So I think it's important to take advantage of that energy and make sure that we learn from not only what they're sharing, but also I think advocacy groups make them part of the work that's going to happen after this.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, may I give the floor to Oreva? And actually there's one additional comment from the chat about how do we see this also in relation to climate change and the fact that often origin countries are also vulnerable to climate change. I don't know, Oreva, if you feel to address this, but also the question of how can we build on our expertise to affect change?
So I think I'll address the first question first. I think as academics, we have the responsibility of reflecting the realities we're seeing in the focus of our research. So for example, I would say that if we want to have an impact on changing in some way the current situation, is to focus on producing or doing research that highlights these issues. For example, if the racialization of the global health system is one of the biggest outcomes of this pandemic, then there should be more academic work that highlights that aspect. And also things like the link between technology, surveillance, and limiting the mobility of human beings. That's an aspect that is also worth focusing on in research. So I think as academics, we can do some meaningful work by focusing our work on those things and highlighting them more.
Thank you very much, Oreva. Yeah, very good point. I think, as you both said, we're both responsible for our classrooms, both the virtual and the real, like the in-presence ones when they start again. And with focusing on research that highlights these issues. And most importantly, I think what Rhacel and Randall also showed is the dynamics behind these issues. So why is this happening? It's not simply because somebody is a bad person and hence a bad exploitative employer. There are important mechanisms that are behind this that are, as you said, that are built on privilege, both economic and racial and ethnic, and that concern places also outside their own countries of origin. And I think that's often difficult to communicate because these are complex issues, but I hope we have helped to cast a little bit of light in these challenges. And I'd like to conclude the seminar by giving back the floor to our host, Adam. Adam, are you there?
I am. Hello, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening or morning or afternoon, wherever you are. And thank you so much, Anna, for hosting, and to all our panelists for such a robust discussion. I can't be alone in feeling like I would have loved to hear a few more rounds of back and forth between Anna and Randall as well. I am just going to very quickly let you know that there is another webinar also on the topic of migration next week, this time specifically focusing on Canada. That's the same time next week. Please do go ahead and sign up for that on our website, and you'll also receive an email tomorrow with instructions on how you can do that. If you enjoyed this webinar and you'd like to see us do more of them, then please do consider supporting us. We are a non-profit organization and we rely on our readers for funding. You can do that by going to opendemocracy.net/donate. And if you'd like us to keep in touch with us and let us know about any future webinars or what we're up to more generally, then please do. You can do that by signing up at opendemocracy.net/newsletters. Thank you very much, everyone, once again, and thanks again to our panelists. Have a lovely evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are.
Thank you too. Bye.
Bye.